slavery was different than was being taught. Slavery was not, it was in Africa, but it was generated by African tribes. The Africans would capture a village, and they'd enslave the ones who were healthy and strong. The elderly would be discarded, and they would try to keep the young, but they would have them doing slave labor. The next group to come over were the Arabs. And they made deals. Basically, they traded for slaves. And then those slaves were traded to England, France, to all over Europe. And then the Europeans said, well, why do we have to go through, why don't we just go there ourselves? And they did. And that's when our history picks up, is when we say, okay, we picked up here, we got the slaves came from Europeans who came over and captured the slaves and took them to Bahamas and brought them to the United States. But it goes way beyond that. It starts long before that. But one of the most dramatic parts of his description was explaining to me that during the capture of the slaves, they were brought out by Africans to the Europeans and sold for virtually nothing, not money, but for beads and a knife. They wouldn't give them guns because they didn't want them turning them on them. But it was virtually for nothing. And they would load these after marching them miles and miles, days, weeks, from across Africa to the West Coast, where they loaded them on to ships. And I don't mean, we're not talking about luxury liners. We're talking about a floating box. And these people, these slaves, were stacked like kindling wood, chained together by their ankles, and just stacked and stacked on top of each other. Even the animals were treated better than the slaves. And the interesting thing was that when they were heading around the Cape, heading back toward the Bahamas, and what they saw was what they called the Americas then. It was the most devastating storm area in the world. It still is today. And when the storm would reach a certain point, it would rage and the ships would, one after the other, would seem like they were going to sink. And the only way that they could keep these people, these ships from sinking, was to get rid of the cargo. Now, keep in mind, there were other things that they could have gotten rid of. Some of the foodstuffs, some of the water, but they didn't do that. What they would do is they would bring up the first slave, and they'd all be chained together, one to the other, and they would start marching them off the ship, one after another. They never dreamed that they would not make it to some place. Why would they put us on a ship just to march us off in the middle of the ocean? Well, rarely did they march them all. Usually they kept enough so that they could pay for the voyage and pay the sailors. But every ship, we were talking hundreds of human beings. And nobody paid attention to this. Nobody cared about it. A century later, the Spanish took the same trip around the Cape to make their conquest on the Americas. The difference is, instead of having humans, they had all of the soldiers' horses. Now, they also had bags of gold. They also had swords, armor, helmets, all these things that they could have gotten rid of. But they didn't. They would march the horses off the ships, one after the other. Hundreds and hundreds of horses. Now, thinking they're going to need these when they get there, wherever it is they're going, didn't matter. It was just surviving the storm. This happened so much, so many times, that it was granted a name. It was called the horse latitudes. Whenever they were within these latitudes, they could expect to lose a significant portion of their horses. So till this day, it's still referred to in naval terms as the horse latitudes. Now, they had divers who went down and discovered and investigated, but they found something very interesting. What they found was that while they had many, many of horse skull and horse bones, they found incredible numbers, thousands, of human bones and human skulls. The human bones still chained together, and they couldn't understand it. What was this all about? Where did this come from? Was this a burial ground? When they searched it back, they found that there were ships, because there were ships that would sank and did have their full complement of slaves. So they put two and two together and discovered that this was the practice of surviving the storms. But they cared so little about the human cargo that they called it the horse latitudes. And that still sticks to that, the horse latitudes. Not the human latitudes, not the slave latitudes. And it was just not too long ago, they did further studies. They did DNA studies and other things to try to track down and follow up. But they found many, many ships' logs and other things that showed that, yes, that's what they did. There was no penalty for it. There was no penalty for killing thousands of helpless slaves chained together. No weapons. Most of them had no clothing. They also had no value, as long as they were on the ship. It wasn't until they got to the Americas and they could march them off, put them into corrals with the other animals, spray them down with the hoses or the buckets of water, clean them up, and march them up to the stockades and to the stocks where they could be sold. They didn't care about the families. They didn't care who died. If they died, they just got rid of them. This is the difference between the history that many of us learned in high school, even in college, and the history that is the verbal truth of the past. And it's not necessarily African American history. I give a longer presentation during Black History Month, but it is not an issue that is limited. It's an issue that needs to be recognized by everyone. these are the things that were the reality. We can't go back and punish people, and we shouldn't even try. But we should recognize that we're not that far from those spaces today. And we think that they could never happen, but I guarantee you that in Europe, there were many, many people who were sitting there thinking, this is not happening, this couldn't possibly happen. But they thought enough that the horses were so bad that we should name it horse latitudes. And it's a heartfelt situation. And I can't say that I didn't believe my great-grandfather, because he never gave me reason not to. But I was actually afraid to believe it. It just can't be that this happened in that way. So when many years later we were looking into these projects and I started to recognize it, I had already made notes about it because I was working on a book, and it began to unravel in my mind. Okay, this is what he was talking about. This was the horse latitudes. This is what he meant by the horse latitudes. But when you get beyond the horse latitudes and you move to the areas where slavery took place here in the United States, and we were not the only place that had slavery. England had slavery. France, Italy, Germany, they were all involved in the slave trade, not just the Arabic countries as well. So it was a worldwide phenomenon. Now there is a significant difference between biblical slaves and civil slaves. The biblical slaves were essentially everyone other than the emperor. Everyone who reported to the emperor was essentially a slave to the emperor. You did what you were told or you were executed. But the civil slavery is where people were forcibly taken from their home, from their family, from their nation, and forced to work for nothing. Nothing. We say, well, you know, that wasn't all that bad. They got a place to sleep. They got meals. They got health care. But that's not exactly the case. Health care was limited, sort of like today. If the plantation owner could afford to have some care, a doctor, a vet, to come and take a look at his property, he would. If they had to, they executed them. Or they sold them off to somebody who really didn't care, and they got a couple of bucks, and you know, this guy would go off and work himself to death. And it was no different for the women. So I don't want to take too much of your time, because I appreciate your being here and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about it, and perhaps I can come back again and discuss the issues in a little more detail. But if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But that's the story of the horse latitudes. And there's so much more I'd like to get into, but it's just not time. I know during Black History Month there'll be a couple of places that I'll be speaking, and I'd love for you to come and hear the long-term and the current results and where we are today, which is, strangely enough, not a whole lot beyond where we were. We've got a long way to go, as people.